When I was about 8 or 9 years old, I remember listening to a song. It was a worship or praise song, and the gist of it, I can't remember the exact words. The gist of it was that we as human beings are like flowers that are completely dependent on God, and without His sustenance, we simply fade away. At that age, I remember while thinking about those words, I was struck with terror for a moment because I thought, what if something happened to God? What would happen to me? Because I'm completely dependent on Him. And while over the years, I've come to understand that of course nothing can happen to God, but the fact is, when we come to understand, when we come to realize the sovereignty of God, how completely dependent we are on Him as human beings, there are different ways that we can react. And I reflected on our different reactions to God's sovereignty when I read this verse, which is Proverbs chapter 19, verse 21, and it reads, "Many are the plans in the mind of a man, but it is the purpose of the Lord that will stand." And God created us in a way such that we are created in God's image. And I think one of the aspects of being in that image is our desire to create, our desire to take control of our environment. And planning is one of the things that we seek out to do this. And before I move on, I need to clarify that this verse in no way tells us not to plan, because in the book of Proverbs, there are very many examples. There are very many exhortations on us to plan for the future, to observe the ants which store up food. And also there's the Proverbs 31. Is it 31 or 30? 31 woman who's one of the greatest qualities of that woman is that she plans. And so by no means does this verse tell us not to plan. However, it talks about one of the attitudes that we can take when we are faced with the sovereignty of God. And the gist of what I'm going to be talking about today is that when we are faced with the sovereignty of God, we need to react to it with obedience, worship, and trust. Let us start with the first one. When we are faced with the sovereignty of God, we need to react to it with obedience. In this verse, Proverbs 19:21, I think the idea is our desire to rebel against the plans of God, where we create our own schemes that are against God's will. And in our flesh, we are inclined to rebel against God's sovereignty. One of the earliest examples in the Bible is that of the Tower of Babel, when after God had instructed human beings to disperse and populate the earth, the people in that time decided to band together and build up a tower, I think as a monument to their own greatness. And I think it was a challenge to God's authority, if I understood that story, that account correctly. And God came down and saw what they were doing, and He confused their languages and scattered them. And this is not just the only example in the Bible of examples of rebellion of human beings against what God has ordained. It just comes to us naturally. However, over and over, the Bible tells us that this approach is going to fail ultimately. that there is no way that our plans that are made against God's will, that are made in rebellion to God, are ever going to stand. And in fact, God is going to use those plans to magnify his own name. And one of the most outstanding examples of God using the rebellion of human beings to fulfill his own purposes is in the crucifixion of Jesus Christ. We see that in that period, the devil entered Judas and led him to betray Jesus Christ. And also the leaders of the Jews at that time plotted to kill Jesus. However, without them realizing what they were doing, they found that everything that they did ended up falling in, bringing God's plans into fruition. The exact way that God had said that his son was going to die was the exact way that these people who were acting out their own evil desires made it happen. And even Judas, the prophecies of the Messiah being being betrayed by someone who is close to him were fulfilled by Judas as he was in rebellion to God. Therefore, the first reaction to God's sovereignty is to understand that our disobedience, our rebellion cannot prosper, and we need to submit to God. We need to be obedient to him. This disobedience is on one end of a continuum of reactions that we can have. And right in the middle of the continuum is worship, which is the second way that we need to react to God's sovereignty. And when it comes to worship, one of the things is that when we do not outwardly rebel against God, one of the other reactions that we might have is to simply try and ignore his existence, act like there is no God at all. In one of the proverbs of Jesus Christ, he talked about a man who had planted, and his harvest was extremely great. And so the man thought to himself that he was going to pull down the barns that he had made to store his grain, and then he would build bigger ones and store his grain in those bigger barns, and he was going to spend the rest of his life in bliss and enjoying the fruits of his labor. However, Jesus says that he did not know that his life was going to end. And that is the end. That is, I think, the approach that most human beings take, where they plan out their lives without any kind of factoring in God in their plans. They ignore the fact that our lives can be quite fleeting. And in the book of James writes about such people who say that we are going to make plans to go to this and this place and make this and this kind of profit. However, James tells us that the right way to do it is saying God willing. And it's not just a mantra that you say at the end of any kind of plans you make for the future. It is a way of reminding yourself that yes, you might make plans. However, ultimately, they are in God's hands, and it is God who is going to decide what becomes of the future. From the Old Testament, there's a story of a king called Asa in 2 Corinthians, and he was a king who instituted a lot of reforms in Judah. A lot of religious reforms, and at during most of his reign, he did, I think, what was right in the eyes of God. However, as he grew more powerful, as God lifted him up and made him successful, he got to the point where when Israel attacked Judah, rather than turning to God and rather than remembering that God was the one who has helped him in the past, he ignored God completely and then looked for help from Syria. And God noted that and spoke to him about the mistake that he had made. And then Asa got sick. He developed some kind of foot disease. And the indictment that the scriptures have against him is that even though he suffered, rather than praying to God, rather than turning to God for help, he turned to the physicians. And from that story, what I get is that it's not the fact that he turned to the physicians, it's the fact that he purposefully chose to ignore God and depend fully and completely to the physicians. So our reactions to God's sovereignty should be worshiping Him, acknowledging that sovereignty over our lives, and turning to Him in prayer and supplication whenever we are making plans. The final way that we can react to God's sovereignty is by trusting Him and by trusting in Him. And this echoes back to how I opened about the story when I realized my life was completely dependent on God and the kind of terror that I felt. As human beings, we are inclined to live in worry about the future. Once you realize that how little control we have over our lives and over the future, we are inclined to, first of all, feel terror. We are inclined to worry. We are inclined to be overly concerned by that lack of control that we have over the future. And the way what results from that is we become overly preoccupied with meeting our needs in the future. We are overly concerned about where will our clothes come from. We are overly concerned about what are we going to eat, what is going to be where are we going to live, what is going to become of our children, what is going to become of our lives. And I think that is a wrong reaction to the sovereignty of God. We are not meant to get to the place where we feel completely helpless, because Jesus tells us that God, who takes care of the sparrows, that where a sparrow cannot die without God knowing about it, and who clothes the grass which withers. God is we are always on God's mind. He cares deeply for us, and our lives are not just they don't mean, it's not that our lives don't mean anything to Him. He cares deeply about our needs, and He desires to meet those needs. And Jesus goes on to reassure us that when we pray, we shouldn't think that God is a kind of father who you pray for fish and He gives you a snake, or you pray for bread and He gives you stone. But rather that God deeply cares for our needs, and He's going to meet them in the future. The fact that we are in God's hands completely should give us a lot of peace. And after you've looked at all these reactions, the negative and also the positive, when you look at the positive reactions to God's sovereignty, I believe that is what living by faith means. Living by faith means living in obedience to God's will, living a life where you worship His control over your life, and living a life where you completely trust that He is going to take care of you.